Folks, for over a year now, we've been extolling the virtues of buying precious metals. As you can see, Fort Knox is about to be audited, and that's imminent, and you're going to see that gold reserves are little to none. What do you think that'll do to the price of gold? And with silver being ransacked with COMEX on the markets, that's sure to follow as well. The only question is, are you going to take action or not? If you haven't, what are you waiting for? And if you have, please take a moment to visit one of our great sponsors here below, the link in the description, and call for the information. It's free. The consultation is free. The cost of not taking advantage of this has lasting consequences, folks. Please tell them John and Chris sent you. You'll be more than happy that you did. Well, everyone, welcome to the podcast. We have monthly contributor, Mr. Alastair Macleod, financial expert and European analyst, joining us for our monthly symposium. We're always honored to have him back. We're very keen to get his insights, particularly on the European market and the EU and what he sees and how he sees it faring over there in relation to what we're looking for with the global reset. And if you are new to the podcast, please do like, subscribe, and share so that others can gain in the knowledge you're being afforded. As you may recall, Alastair has a robust history in the financial market since 1970. He's been a professional advisor in many different roles, and he's also a precious metals expert as well, which we all agree is vital to our existence going forward. And so we're going to gain all his insights today. Alastair, how are you doing this evening, good sir?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me on.
Always a privilege. Thank you for being here. Okay, so I mentioned it, so let's start with that, Alastair, right up your wheelhouse. Europe seems to be obviously in deep trouble. Their GDP is down. Their trade imbalance is so disproportionate. Even your Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, admitted tacitly last week that the globalist system is unsustainable at best and will not work against President Trump's asset-backed economic plan. So with that being said, how much longer can Europe keep this facade going before they inevitably implode, or are we already at that point now?
Well, I mean, the two separate elements of this, obviously,
Sure.
there's the UK. Since Brexit, we're no longer part of the EU.
Correct.
And we certainly do have big problems. The government is trying hard to put its finances in order. But the problem is that things start slipping away from it. And the tax increases on things like, the sort of employment taxes, as it were, which were raised in the budget last autumn, are going to begin to bite now because they were due to come in on this new tax year, which starts on April the 6th. A lot of businesses are basically cutting back on employment because they've got no option. And quite a few of them are closing as well. It's really hitting the small and medium-sized businesses very, very hard. So I think we're going to see an increase in unemployment. I think, well, that's already happening. And also we're seeing, I think, a downturn in GDP, certainly in the private sector. The deficit, of course, sort of, if you like, bolsters the nominal GDP number, but it's completely unproductive and therefore does tend to lead to inflation. The other problem that the current government faces is that the disruption in the treasury market basically is pushing up the cost of funding through gilts being our government bonds. And it's even higher than it was at the time when we had that debacle over Liz Truss, when the markets just sort of said no, and there was a sort of mini crisis amongst the pension funds. It looks like it's going to go higher. I mean, the interest rates and bond yields will go higher. Why? Because inflation is a problem, and that's a global problem, and it's been thrown into sharp relief by US tariff policies. So that's one problem. Europe does have its problems as well. The economy is basically stagnated over the last 20 years. There's no other word for it. The problem we have, of course, is that they all produce statistics which, quite frankly, are unbelievable. What we do know is that European governments are deeply in debt, and particularly the French, the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Belgians. The only government which isn't really, sort of extremely high debt to GDP, in terms of government debt to GDP, is Germany. But that was because it disciplined itself. But with this new government, they're removing the discipline. And consequently, that is going to be a high debt to GDP. I think eventually, I can see that, the whole of the European system is going to basically fall apart. And it'll fall apart because of the contradictions, if you like, within the financial system. The ECB, along with other major central banks, is deeply into negative equity. It needs to recapitalize itself. It doesn't have a single government it can turn to. It turns to the individual key holders, who are the national central banks. And I guess that most of them are going to require parliamentary approval in order to subscribe for new equity in the ECB. And not only that, but they're themselves very often in negative equity. So they're going to have to raise equity to put their balance sheets straight. Now, this is not a good thing because when interest rates rise, bond yields rise, there are going to be casualties. And obviously, central banks are going to want to rescue these casualties. And that being the case, their balance sheets aren't in a position really to do it and retain confidence. I mean, people say, well, central bank can always print more currency. Well, sort of, maybe to a limited extent. But basically, they need to recapitalize themselves. It's a situation which can be ignored for a while, but not forever, and particularly when you get a crisis in the commercial banking network. And I think it's quite likely to happen in Europe because of the very high leverage, which is really the result of negative interest rates, 3-4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Negative interest rates basically meant that banks had to increase their balance sheet leverage in order to be profitable. And of course, the problem now is they've increased their balance sheet leverage, interest rates have risen, and they're now running scared of risk. And that basically means their lending to the private sector is being restricted. And if you restrict lending to the private sector, then you're in a recession. And that's basically the problem. Also, I think on the geopolitical side, Europe is completely lost over the Ukraine. And this is, I think, a huge concern. They're running around saying, we're going to intervene, we're going to do this, we're a peacekeeping force, whatever.
Yeah.
And then, Metz, the new leader of the chancellor, if you like, of the German government, is talking about sending missiles, which, as I understand it, requires actually to have German officers on the ground. Now, that just drags Germany, if you like, into the Ukraine conflict. Mm-hmm. That is not good. The answer to your question is there are problems. There are problems.
Sure. And I appreciate, firstly, that you made a distinction between, England and the European Union. I understand, of course, I understand that there are two distinct differences, but at the same time, they're sort of indirectly close cousins because as one goes, the other goes. And England is definitely being challenged right now, to say the least, as you mentioned, both geopolitically and financially. And there's always historically overspill, right?
Yeah.
And so that's, why I was kind of bringing that up, but I'm glad that you sort of separated that out. I want to draw your attention to something, Alastair, that a couple of slides here I thought were pretty interesting. Right up your wheelhouse, of course. Let me know when you can see the screen here.
Yep.
Okay, so I've done this before, and it seemed to be beneficial to you and hopefully to your respective audience. So I thought we would do a reprise. No surprise to you, gold hits a 23 record high year to date. UBS has, which I believe is not too far from you over there, has raised target price from 3,500 to 3,800. So we're seeing the obvious uptick in gold here in America, and obviously I think throughout the world. But there was a couple of other touch points I wanted to add to that. This is off of our Telegram. Let me know if you can still see this, the switch that I made. You see the other slide here?
Yeah.
Okay. So S&P 500 chart, interestingly enough, has formed a death cross indicator for the first time since March of 2022. Again, I'm sure this is no surprise to you, but I think these are interesting talking points. And then lastly here, our Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is going to be begin interviewing to replace Fed Chair Powell, whose tenure ends next May, technically, but these things are always subject to change. And it seems to me that President Trump is really sticking the onus on Powell because they refuse to lower the interest rates. But it just seems to be an inevitability crash course of us removing the private Western central bank as we return back to a gold standard, and sticking it on the Fed is the perfect escape hatch or scapegoat, if you like, for this whole thing. So, with all that said, I was just kind of curious to get your impressions on these events.
I think trying to bully Powell into, let's say, a politically desirable interest rate policy is very, very bad news. It's completely wrong. I mean, there have been stories that Powell will be sacked and all the rest of it, not that the president has the power to do that. Powell is there to do a particular job. Now, I have a view that all central banks actually are doing this the wrong way. But the fact of the matter is that he's got a mandate to deliver on, and that is to control inflation as much as possible, consistent with a reasonably full employment outlook. Now, the inflation problem is still there, and it's going to increase as a result, if nothing else, of Trump's tariffs. So there is absolutely no way that you're going to get cuts in interest rates in 2025 because of that factor. And if Trump doesn't like it, he's got a problem. If he sacks Powell or Powell walks, just imagine what happens to the dollar. I mean, this is just not being thought through. It really is not. You do not have either a Treasury Secretary or the head of your central bank throwing in the towel because of a dispute with a leading politician like prime minister or president. So I can't see that happening. I mean, it's interesting in that we had this U-turn on tariffs, delayed for 90 days, except for China, of course. Now, I have no doubt that that was the US Treasury running scared, noticing what happened to the bond yields and noticing what happened to the dollar. Quite clearly, in that panic, foreigners, and I guess particularly China, were selling. They were getting the hell out of dollars, the hell out of dollar assets, and particularly US Treasuries, being the liquid way out, if you like. So Besant has to turn around to Trump and say, look, unless you back down on these tariffs, I can tell you, we're going to have a real currency crisis and funding crisis on our hands. Do you want that, Mr. President? Now, I think that the situation was so stark that Trump, who is notorious for not listening to other people, I think had to listen to that, which is interesting. It means that effectively Trump is on the run. He's on the run politically. And I think this means that there is likely to be a change, if you like, in the way Trump does business. I think he's probably going to have to listen to advice more. I think being on the run, I think what his problem is that the most beautiful word, tariffs, is the one thing that he's really been relying on, has been proved to be so disruptive as to be impractical as a political policy. So that is something which he's going to have to learn to live with. And I think we're all going to discover that he has to back down on that. He also has other problems because, the Ukraine situation he was going to solve in one day, you may recall.
Mm-hmm.
That's nowhere near being resolved. It is clear what Russia needs, what Russia is demanding. I don't think there's any dispute over that. But the Europeans are not prepared to accept it. And the poor Ukrainians in the middle of this have lost so many lives. For what? To be abandoned by America. This is a very unhappy situation. And then, of course, we got the Middle East. I suppose at least there is a delegation going to be talking to Iran. That is at least something. Trump has had to back down on that. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever. But what he is finding is that the policies upon which he was elected are basically being blown out of the water. I don't know how the tariff thing is going to progress, but the one thing it's done is it's actually, if I can use the word, pissed off everybody abroad. And I think this is very, very important to understand. China is now taking the view, well, there's no point in us raising our tariffs. We're obviously not going to be dealing with these guys. So, forget it. And in any event, they export more to BRICS countries than they do to America. They've deliberately tried to move their emphasis away from America. And of course, they're talking to both Japan and South Korea. Now, that's another thing. I would guess that Trump has now been told by, whoever's got the guts to stand up to him, look, all you're doing is you're just driving Japan and South Korea into the Chinese camp. Do you really want that, Mr. President? And this is terribly important because China is already well ahead of America in technology. Also, on the purchasing power parity basis, its economy is actually larger than the US economy. We're not talking about something, sort of America is dominating the world anymore. No, China is dominating the world with its partners and with the partners who are hosed off at Trump's policies and therefore are being driven into the China-Russia camp. These are very, very important moves. And not only that, but I can see that virtually all Southeast Asia will be looking to do deals with China now, where they haven't done them before. They'll be looking at a huge, great free trade area, which of course taps in to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS and all the countries which have been too frightened of America to join BRICS. They're going to be turning their backs on America. And we need to think about the implications of that, particularly for the dollar. And this is why what happened the other day, I think, was just a foretaste of what's to come.
A lot of gold in there, Alastair, a lot of meaty subtext in what you said. So I'm going to try to take what I, heard you say and pull it apart. And I don't say this, of course, to be contradictory or anything like that. I wouldn't do that. But just to let you know, I believe the Federal Reserve Act has a clause in it that the president can fire a Fed chair if they find malfeasance. And we both know that there's plenty of that here in America and throughout the whole of the world. So I think he might have a case for that. I thought it would probably be, a last resort, but it is on the table. Also,
but what I would say, John, what I would say is if they go down that route, they will destabilize the dollar big time and also bond yields.
Right.
I mean, it would be the stupidest thing to go in that direction. It really would.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that's another point in the process that we can discuss. But I don't know if you saw earlier today, Javier Milei, president of Argentina, as you know, has said he wants to come to the table to make a trade deal with the US. And I think that's significant only in the sense that we believe as a team that Argentina is the substantive baseline for how, I'm going to tie this into your point, how the BRICS will go, right? In that, if you remember, I think it was just about a month ago, Argentina was the first country to say we're going to do zero reciprocal trade tariffs, which is ostensibly mirroring, right? Whatever they do, we do, and vice versa. And I think that's going to be the baseline for what happens with the BRICS countries, whereby they're going to run into the safety of BRICS. China's housing a lot of that, buying a lot of gold to repatriate BRICS, but also to pay back us, the US, what they owe us in terms of different bonds and land deals and things that they did in previous administrations. But you already see the dollar, I think last week it went below 100. And it's slated to go, I think, even lower, what is the dollar hate? Competition. And what's it getting? Plenty of that from gold, and not to mention its close cousin silver, which we discuss all the time. But it is going to help BRICS. And I think in some way that's his plan, he wants these countries to compete evenly in trade and commerce, because US products, as you know, are so disparate and disproportionate in other countries. They don't buy US products. Well, take Vietnam, for example, who's negotiating with us right now. It's so cheap to live over there because they can suppress their currency and live off our dollar. But when the dollar goes down, it's going to actually, in a good way, force their country, as an example of many BRICS, to come up to their true value, which in Vietnam might be hurtful, but in terms of trade balance, it's going to be a lot more even with respect to goods and supplies as well as the currency, which it really should be, because they shouldn't be living artificially. Same with Iraq, same with a lot of countries. So that might go in some way a pathway to explain, why he's doing what he's doing. But our dollar has been backed by nothing. It's completely artificial. It has to be reset because it needs to go back to a gold standard, and I think that's kind of what he's doing.
I actually don't buy this argument at all about BRICS and so on. I mean, the idea that China, I mean, I've heard stories that China has suppressed its currency and all the rest of it. I mean, it may be, but I mean, if you're going to suppress your currency, then there are going to be consequences, and you can't do that forever. If, let us say, China suppresses its currency and makes its goods cheap, why not buy its goods? I mean, this actually is the reality. The line that I understand totally what you're saying, but the line that you've been pursuing is a macroeconomic line. And the whole basis of macroeconomics is that governments manage economic outcomes, not free markets. And that's where that is the big change, really, from the 1930s onwards, and particularly from the Second World War onwards. When it comes to Milei, there is no doubt that he has advised, or he has been watched very closely by Trump and some of his close confidants, like Elon Musk and so on and so forth. I understand he has even advised them on certain points. I think that he is a poster boy, if you like, for what Trump wants to achieve. But the problem Trump has is that he's a businessman. I mean, I wouldn't even say he's a politician. He's certainly not an economist, because otherwise he wouldn't be going down this rather ridiculous tariff route. So, but when it comes to the BRICS nations, they're actually in an interesting situation, because you mentioned that a lot of them owe dollars. Yes, this is very, very true. But as those dollar loans fall due, then I have no doubt that the Chinese and the IMF replacement, which is based in Shanghai for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, will come up with alternatives, presumably Chinese yuan, whatever. Now, what that means is that from their point of view, a collapsing dollar is actually very, very good news. Now, this is something which I don't think people have really factored in. That with the change, the shift, if you like, in the tectonic plates, geopolitical tectonic plates, the whole relationship between all these countries and the US dollar is really changing big, big time. They're no longer looking to the West for bribes, if you like, which is the way we've treated them. They're no longer prepared to accept our sort of imperialist colonialism, if you like, or imperialism, whereby we reckon that they are subservient to us. They're seeing China. They don't necessarily like to have foreigners on their soil, and that's true of Chinese as well. But they get into commercial relationships with China, and China, with those commercial relationships, is helping to develop African nations, and also if you like, the emerging nations, the poor nations in South America. The Latin Americans do have a problem insofar as America's presence is a lot more there than, say, in Africa or Southeast Asia. But I think also the reason that Milei didn't take up the invitation to join BRICS, I think that was in the wake of the Johannesburg meeting, I think quite simply was he needed America on his side in order for him to pursue his economic plans, which basically were to cut back big time. He needed the support, if you like, of his creditors in his policies. So he had to back out of BRICS. Otherwise, I have no doubt he would have stayed in it. I mean, because these countries, given half a chance, will pursue their vested interests.
Mhm.
In the past, what's happened is they've been very frightened of America. Not only is America a creditor, but the Chinese will have told them, look, the way the Americans work is they do a sort of a hump and dump type operation. They'll raise interest rates, break you, and then walk in and buy you out.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that's an oversimplification, but then you get people like John Bolton saying, well, of course, yeah, we do arrange coups d'etats. We do arrange regime change. I mean, well, we know this, but I mean, when you get top officials actually admitting to it, I mean, he's no longer a top official, but he was part of the Trump 1 team. You can see that, the Americans are not liked. In fact, they're bloody well hated because of the way in which they muscle in and do things. I mean, look at Pakistan. Very, very good example. Imran Khan been in jail for goodness knows how long. Why? I mean, he was, if you like, taking a realistic view on how to improve Pakistan's prospects by being, if you like, very much in the Asian camp as opposed to the American camp. And he was talking to the Chinese. The Chinese were investing in Pakistan. And then what happens? Coup d'etat, and the old people who were all bribed in the past by the Americans were back in power. This is what goes on. And I think it is important for Americans to realize just how bad foreign policy has been conducted in the past. And nobody loves you now. This is a problem. I mean, it's a problem for all of us, actually.
Mhm.
And this is something which I think is being, I mean, Trump's policies, basically, it just made the whole thing so much worse, really, so much worse.
Mhm. Well, I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate your, obviously, why you're here, your point of view, and it's valid in many ways. I think the overarching point, though, Alastair, I'm trying to make is that we here stateside, and the people here, just like they would in England or any place else, eventually, it's the truth is going to get out. There's a lot of manipulation and suppression in the news, and a lot of mindset work that went in to get to that point. But I think here we're starting as a collective society. The consensus now is that the U.S. dollar is not backed by anything, so we don't even have any confidence of it here. I'm speaking specifically the Federal Reserve. No,
Yeah,
that's neither federal has any reserves, but the perception of it,
yeah.
the good faith and credit of the U.S. government. What does that mean? We don't have any of it.
Precisely.
It's an oxymoron. It doesn't
It's
exist.
eroding, yeah.
Well,
It's
it's
eroding.
it's gone. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's been dead. Just nobody wanted to proclamate it. I mean, if you think of the dollar, maybe has about a penny worth of value at this point on a good day, with the wind blowing properly. But the people are realizing that now. So my point being is, if we in the U.S. are realizing that collectively as a society, it's already abundantly clear to these BRICS nations, for example. And so I think if you're positioned properly, being a contrarian to the old corrupt system, you stand to gain very well. And it's our belief. You can agree or disagree. That's completely fine. This is a dialogue. That I think one of the things he wants to do is create a sense of nationalism for these countries by going back to the gold standard, where we now maintain a real value for the dollar, which we have not had since 1913, truly. And then these countries can get away from the dollar hegemony and the bullying, as you said, from the sort of the deep state regimes that have predominated for so long. You're quite right about that. And we're in a lot of countries where we really have no business being there. And it would be best for all concerned to just break away and establish themselves independent and live on the assets in the ground, which, as you know, many of these nations have a glut of them, or replete with, awash with gold and many other things. Which is kind of a good follow-up question, Alistair, to this good discussion, which is President Trump has a bold and creative plan to purchase Greenland in part due to their vast mineral rights. But what I wanted to ask you about is, it's not, I hear a couple of people talking about it, but I don't think it's covered as much as it should be. And that is, what about the shipping port access it affords, especially in terms of faster supply chain of goods to the US, because that area is largely dominated by China and other nations. Do you think that's a motivating factor? And how much in the way of precious metals do you think Greenland actually possesses?
Well, we need to ignore, if you like, the fact that Greenland's property rights are not the property of America. That's the first thing. Okay, let's ignore that for a moment and answer your question. Undoubtedly, there are mineral reserves in there. I mean, I even remember as a broker, we used to have various companies. I can't remember what the names were now. I mean, it was a long time ago. I'm going back, what, 30 years or so, who were prospecting for gold in Greenland. And, you know, they'd come along and they'd do their presentation and, you know, they would say, it looks like we've got these reserves and all, you know, all this sort of stuff. So undoubtedly, there are interesting prospects in Greenland. It's not America's property. I think perhaps what Trump is more looking at is he wants to basically just sort of concentrate on America. He's, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, they can go to hell. He just wants America. So he wants to control everything from the top end of America down to certainly the other side of Mexico and probably further ideally. And this I think is the basis of his rants, really, about, you know, Canada should be another state of America, Greenland should be ours, etc., etc. And all he's done actually is just anger people and made people in Canada and Greenland, and I guess also in Panama, just absolutely, you know, anti-Trump. I can't think of any better way to lose friends. That's what he's done. As far as you were saying about, you know, ports being controlled by foreigners, I mean, this is obviously the case over Panama, and this is something which, you know, he wants to correct. I'm not quite sure how he can correct that, to be honest, because a deal has been done and that's it. It's actually owned by, I think it was owned by a Hong Kong operation, you know, sort of both ends of the canal. So, you know, that's got to be, you know, if he wants it, then I'm sure there's a price, I guess. But I think this is really what, you know, he's doing. He's just sort of thinking about it. You know, North America is mine. I'm going to have it. I'm going to ensure that we don't depend on any foreigners for everything. And we're just going to control that. We're going to shut down bases abroad. We're going to do this, do that. We've got to cut federal spending big time. You know, Elon Musk is working on that. We've got to, you know, all this stuff, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work simply because there are these commitments, government commitments, which he just can't ride over roughshod. I mean, it's, and also, you know, as I say, Greenland is part of Denmark, and Canada is a sovereign nation. It really is as simple as that. And I don't think there's any further debate. If he wants to pursue down that line, then I think he's just going to undermine his credibility even further. I think he's seen as somewhat mad outside America. I mean, he's nuts.
Well, I think people who are trailblazers tend to be unorthodox, and you know, anytime you be the first one out of the gate, you're going to be construed that way. But I think there's a larger plan that has not been shown to us just yet. And he did make actually a tacit offer proposition, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it, $10,000 to Greenland residents to come over. So I'm not sure how that's been received, but I know that that has been an offer that's been made. It's probably just an initial part of like a negotiating instrument. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But I was just curious to see, like you said, about
I think you've got more faith in Trump than I have. I mean, I see someone who basically is not a politician.
No,
he's got in. He doesn't listen to people. He's got a mandate, which is entirely understandable, because You know, the people in America, you know, basically they're tired of, you know, all the woke stuff and so on and so forth. They've lost jobs because, you know, middle America has been hollowed out, basically,
Right.
as corporations have closed, as corporations have moved production into Mexico, Canada, Asia, wherever. I can understand that is that anger, and that's what he's tapped into.
Mhm.
But it's not the solution. It's not the solution to America. And okay, we all have to accept that it's happening. You know, this is all different. But John, this is coming. This is coming at the time which is so like 1929 to 32. It is scary.
Mhm.
Why? Because we have the most enormous debt bubble in history.
Mhm.
The other side of a debt bubble is the credit bubble. So people who don't understand they're in a credit bubble, just look at the debt bubble, because this is the other side of it. Stocks are wildly overvalued, top of the credit bubble. Then we get Trump's tariffs. The credit bubble is considerably larger proportionately than the one in 1920s, 28, 29. The trade tariffs are even more destructive than Smoot-Hawley. Remember that Smoot-Hawley came at a time when only something like 2 to 3% of US GDP was imports and exports. It was a self-contained economy. It's not anymore. You have huge, great supply chains being destroyed by these tariffs. So you've got these, you know, the two things are so much worse than in 1929. Wall Street fell 89%. 9,000 banks went bust or closed down. You know, and it's worse this time. I mean, these guys just don't know what they're playing with. And everybody, I mean, I find it extraordinary that you have people in the market just completely unaware of history and why it is relevant. That's the problem we have. And I mean, this is very, very, very serious. And the idea that Trump has got a plan B or he's got some hidden agenda or whatever, no, he hasn't got a clue what he's doing. That is the real problem. I mean, look at what happened, you know, his mess over tariffs. And people say, oh, well, after the deal. Oh, come on. Certainly not. I mean, this is just rubbish. I'm afraid it is extremely serious. And this has to be taken by everybody very, very seriously, not making excuses for Trump or for what's happening. This is happening, and it is going to be catastrophic for so many people. This is why gold is going up. It's not gold going up, it's the dollar going down.
Down.
It's
Yeah.
every currency going down. The first people to realize this, and we saw this in this last 2 weeks, are the foreigners. They get the hell out of the dollar. They're getting the hell out of other currencies. How do they do this? They go into real legal money, which is gold, without counterparty risk. That's what they're doing. That's why the central banks are getting rid of paper and getting into physical gold.
Mhm.
The situation then becomes, eventually, people in America wake up to what's going on to the dollar. They understand, and you actually alluded to this, they begin to understand that what's happening is not gold going up, but the dollar going down, not prices rising,
Mhm.
but the currency going down. Now, when the general public realize that, and they don't realize it at all yet, the dollar is doomed. That is inevitably what happens. And that has been the lesson of every fiat currency failure in history. Read it up, read up the history, and you'll see that that's what's happening. And we're in the stage where the foreigners are beginning to sell because they realize the dollar's going down. That eventually spreads into the general public, and then the currency is doomed. This is something which is actually very, very serious.
Well, there's no doubt. That's why we're having this conversation and try to illuminate this discussion. I would say to you that my faith is, this is just my personal vantage point. My faith is in the Lord Jesus, not in a politician or a businessman or anyone else for that matter. But I do believe that God uses people for certain times in history. And it's my belief that he's using President Trump for that. Now, that being said, I totally agree with you that I think we believe that we have about I mean, you mentioned it, the Great Depression, and that was just stateside, this or countryside. This time it's global, and that's what makes it so much bigger and more systemic, as you're aware. I think we have about a 5-year window to get, if at best, to get out of the dollar, and that's why we talk to our audience about positioning them out of the dollar into physical assets like gold and silver, land, and many other sundry things that you can possess and own, that you can be self-sufficient and ostensibly become your own central bank because of the inevitability of what's going on. And you're right, the dollar is, you can't even say it's losing, because it really never had any purchasing power to begin with. It had a perceived purchasing power. It had a hegemony over the world, but that's now changing front of scenes, like you mentioned. So with that said, what I wanted to ask you, the next question was, in the current environment, besides investing in hard assets, do you also think it'd be wise to invest in stocks that own hard assets, ships, oil wells, pipelines, real estate, things of that nature?
Not really, no. I mean, I think the problem that you face is that we've seen the start of the market going down. I mean, you showed, I think, a very, very important chart with the S&P and a death cross and all the rest of it.
Right.
But clearly what's happening is that sectors which were being bought on a momentum basis, in other words, bought only because they were rising, they are now the first ones to fall. Another sector which is now doing very badly is financials. And that is a warning signal, if you like, about where this is going. I think that as, let's say, mainstream equities, let's put it that way, you know, it's spreading from the Magnificent Seven downwards, and also you know, cryptocurrencies are involved in this as well, because it's the same cohort along of Bitcoin. As they go down, you've got, according to FINRA's numbers, you've got something like a short trillion of margin debt against securities. Now, most of that, I think, is against equities. Foreigners own 14.5 trillion of US equities. Are these guys going to hang out? No, they're not going to hang around. So what we're now looking at is a potential collapse in the stock market. When I say collapse, I don't know that it's going to be one day or 1 year or 5 years. I mean, that is something that we, you know, will be revealed in time. But that's the direction in which it is going. And the problem is not just, you know, oh dear, we've lost money. No, the problem is that collateral, you know, we're talking about the collateral for the banking system. And with the debt traps that the government is in, we're also talking about rising bond yields, which again, I mean, we've already had enough trouble in the commercial real estate sector. And to the extent to which residential property is financed by mortgages, you can see that rising bond yields are going to kill those prices as well. I mean, the only assets you can really hold are ones that produce things independent of everything else. Now, you have to forget their values, because where there is leverage, if you like, in the asset sector, then there are going to be people in distress and they're going to be sellers on the market. And that includes land. The way you have to look at land, let's say farmland, let's simplify the statement. The way you have to look at it is, right, I reckon that I'm going to need to secure my own food and also to have food to sell to others, whatever. That's a sensible thing to do. Yeah, I would agree with that. But don't buy it because you think that your wealth is going to be preserved. No, you will be preserved, not your wealth.
Right.
You want to preserve your wealth, then the only thing you can possibly do is to get into gold, which has no counterparty risk, is legal money and has been since Roman times, possibly silver as well. If you want to deal in stocks, rebalancing your portfolio, then quite clearly the place to go is the mining sector, and particularly gold mines, silver mines. And the out on that is not just the price of gold rising or appearing to rise, but actually what's happening is the purchasing power of the currency collapses. The fact of the matter is there's a whole world out there which we're ignoring, and that is China, Russia, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, probably joined by South Korea, Japan, the whole of Southeast Asia. Even Taiwan is going to have to reconsider its position with this unreliable, if you like, partner looking after it in the form on the other side of the Pacific. So, I mean, there is that whole world there, and they're going to need raw materials. And we're talking about what we sort of call the emerging markets, if you like, or emerging economies, rapidly industrializing. It's very, very exciting. While we're going down to hell in a handcart, the rest of the world actually is trying to get away from us because they got things to do. And the way to benefit from that, I think, is to look at stocks or businesses, whatever, that are supplying them. And that obviously is the mining sector.
True. When I was talking about land, Alistair, it wasn't so much about wealth, but about sustainability, survivability. You know,
Yeah,
like you
absolutely.
said,
I'm with you entirely on that. Yeah,
more
with you
more
entirely
more
on
of
that.
wealth preservation and just sustainability, really. And I'm also thinking about, I don't know how it is over there in England, although I can't imagine it's entirely different than the US. There's larger parcels of land, farmland, et cetera, like you mentioned. Oftentimes where it has mineral rights on it, meaning natural gas, oil, who knows, gold and such. Whereas the property owner that you own it outright, if you're in that, fortuitous position,
Yeah, no, we have a different system here.
yeah,
The
please.
mineral rights are separate from the land rights.
Okay.
So in other words, the fact that you own a farm somewhere
Mhm.
means that you don't own the mineral rights on it. It's completely separate. Sorry. So just to clarify that.
No, that's why I appreciate. That's why I said I don't know how it works over there in relation to the US. So that's what you're educating us on, that cultural landscape of how things work differently. But here in America, a lot of times, depending on what state you're in, parcel of land, but oftentimes there are mineral rights on there. If you own the land, outright, you can take advantage of those mineral rights, and it can actually help, in some cases, maintain or even grow your wealth because it taps into things that we've already discussed. So that's why, again, just wanted to explore the space for the sake of the audience to see how they can benefit. Because I'm with you in the sense that over the next 5 years, we have a window of time or a tincture of time here where we can take advantage of this cyclonic dollar shift, if you like, and position ourselves properly away from that and become self-sufficient, which is what we encourage our audience to largely do. And I would imagine to some extent you with yours as well. Couple more questions, Alastair, for you for the sake of time. I'm not sure if the Fed is going to act anytime soon. Tariffs, DOGE you mentioned earlier with Elon Musk, are all part of the Mar-a-Lago Accord attempts to spur U.S. productivity and slow U.S. debt growth. While I wish and hope for success, I suspect that maybe we've gone too far over the edge to recover. What are your thoughts?
I think you've gone too far over the edge to recover. I mean, apart from the Mar-a-Lago Accord and so on and so forth. I mean, the fact is that the reaction to the tariffs basically is pushing the world into a very deep recession. I'd call it a slump, actually. And what that does is it undermines the ability of governments to finance themselves. Their deficits, their budget deficits, start rocketing, and either their trade deficit moves up more or less in tandem, or if that's not permitted because of tariffs, which is the situation, basically the purchasing power of the currency takes a bad knock, goes down. So there is absolutely no way that the Fed, or even if you get a new Fed chairman, there's no way they can finance this, from America's point of view, by trying to suppress interest rates. I mean, all they do is they just kill the dollar. They'll probably end up killing the dollar anyway, because they're going to have to rescue so many businesses and banks and things which are going wrong on the back of higher interest rates and collapsing equity markets. I mean, the bill, if you like, for zombie corporations and all the rest of it is going to be so enormous. I mean, I wouldn't like to be in Powell's position. And I think the last thing
Mm-mm.
I'd want is a president who's badgering you to reduce interest rates. It is actually a lot more serious than I think Trump realizes. In fact, I'm sure he doesn't realize how serious it is. I think Besant is beginning to get the message. Note how he's backtracked from virtually everything that he said when, before he went into office, because he's faced with the reality of the situation.
Right.
We're
Right.
no longer talking. We're no longer talking about going along and looking at Fort Knox and I mean, I think he's talking about setting up a wealth fund, but I mean, that's a complete nonsense apart from anything else. What's the point of doing that? Is he sort of going to try and sort of impart some sort of feeling of backing for the dollar so that he can just print more credit? Is that the operation? I mean, I'm sorry, it's not going to cut any ice. It really is not.
Well, I agree with you in the sense that, yeah, Powell's in an unenviable position, and a lot of times people come in and out of the scene. Keep your friends close, enemies closer, and such. But I get the sense there has actually been, I don't know if you're aware, Alastair, a gin up discussion or a reinstatement, for lack of a better term, of the Fort Knox being audited, and next would precipitate the Fed being audited to show the people. So I think this is part of the wake up operation. But I think the overarching point to this is that have faith in the things that you can take it back to the Constitution, take it back to our founding fathers.
Yeah.
I'm saying this from an American standpoint, not speaking for you.
Yeah, sure. No,
take it back to God's principles, living off the land, helping one another. Precious metals or God's money has been around for eons and eons.
Yeah.
Get back to basics, I think, is what we're saying, and start
yeah.
to rebuild communities, synergize, because our greatest strength, and I don't think I'm being naive when I say this, our greatest strength is each other. Our currency is each other. As we work together through education, galvanization, and resources, I think we can build the world in which we all want to live. I think is kind of
well, that's the way it should work. But
Right.
Successive administrations in America have destroyed that completely. You're not going to get there,
Well,
unfortunately.
Past administrations, yes, I agree. But I also think that because God is giving us a grace period of time here to pivot away from the old system, as you rightly said, we have another grace period here where, again, 100% of people are not going to take advantage. We know that. What we're trying to do is, I think you and I and others, is get as many people a seat at the table as possible to mitigate the collateral damage, knowing that we will never do that 100%, but we can certainly do our part. And I know you would agree with that. Last question for today, Alastair, is you were speaking about this before, so it just makes sense to talk about it, and that is the Treasury bond yield market, both the 10-year and the 30-year cycle, short and long term. The movement last week was a basis trade issue, as you know, commonly misquoted as being a tariff issue, China selling issue, or bond vigilantes, which are all false narratives. It's a product of margin calls on large hedge funds that have taken intervention from the White House and now possibly the Fed. They seem to have addressed it temporarily, but it certainly can lead to something systemic if not monitored and addressed. How many times can the Fed or the White House put a Band-Aid on the big wounds until something eventually breaks big time?
Yeah, well, I think we saw the start of that crisis. I mean, the thing to understand in terms of, when you lend money to someone else is if the risk associated with that loan increases, then you require a higher interest rate to compensate. That's basically what the foreigners are now saying. They will not only require a higher interest rate, but the problem is that higher interest rates make the US government's finances even worse. This is called a debt trap. And the only way out of a debt trap is to ensure that your GDP base, and I'm talking about private sector GDP, is growing more rapidly than your debt. It's not. It's now going into reverse. We're going into, they call it a recession. When you get major banks saying that, I think it was the Goldmans or someone said, we reckon there's a 60% chance of a recession. What they're actually saying is, we're in a recession. I mean, make no mistake. That is actually what they're saying. That's what they mean.
Right.
If it's in a recession, then the tax base, if you like, that covers the interest on the debt is going into reverse. And that is a classic debt trap. We had this in England, or in Britain rather, in the 1970s, in 1976. And then it started off with the sterling crisis. The Americans, God bless them, came in and supported sterling. They then put in their bankers, in other words, called the IMF, to basically push in a loan so that they could get their dollars back. That was fine. But as a result of that, I mean, the IMF did exactly what our government should have done. But the consequence was that when you look at the bonds that were issued, the gilts, which is our government bonds, there were 3 of them with coupons of 15, 15.25, and 15.5%. Think what that would do to the situation in America. Think what that would do to the dollar's finances. And that's where you're going. It's not a question of, this is not something under Powell's control.
Right.
He can only make it worse. And I think that's what's got to be understood. So important to understand that. Because the way it is going, and I cannot see any escape, the way it is going, you're going to get far higher interest rates. We're going to get far higher interest rates too. I mean, we're in exactly the same boat. And I mean, of the G7 nations, there's only one which doesn't have debt to GDP in excess of 100%, and that's Germany. But guess what? With the new Chancellor Metz, Germany has basically taken the, it's basically increasing its debt obligations in the name of rescuing Ukraine, whatever, spending money on defense. I mean, all G7 are in the same mess. This is awful. It's not just America, it's everyone. The whole of the fiat currency system is beginning to fail. That's really what we're seeing. And that's what the gold price is telling us.
Yeah, it's telling a story. And we talked about this a long time ago, Alastair. It's a global reset, but it's an east-west reset this time. I think that's the big shift.
It is. And I think the interesting thing, I mean, people sort of use this term reset. I think if you used it correctly, but so many people think it's governments resetting it. No, it's markets basically taking control away from governments. And I think that's the thing to understand. Governments have no control over this situation.
Interesting. There's a lot to ponder on just that point alone, let alone the other stuff that we talked about. So, Alastair, as we close up, and thank you for all of your interesting information, advice, and historic perspective, because I agree with you, in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you've been, right? Otherwise, you'll just be doomed to repeat it, as the old axiom goes. Last thoughts that you have for the audience, as always, and where can people find your work?
I run my own Substack, which of course will be familiar to those of you in California in particular, because it's a Californian operation, a brilliant operation. It allows me to concentrate on writing, which is what I do. And the Substack is alastairmacleod.substack.com. Or if you Google Macleod Finance, you'll probably be directed in that direction. I mean, my mission basically is to get people to understand what's going on, inform them, so that they can protect themselves from what undoubtedly are going to be very, very difficult times for them. Make them aware and also make them know how to protect themselves. And that's what I basically do. So subscribers welcome. Absolutely.
We'll leave that link in the description, as we always do customarily. Alastair Macleod, thank you, sir, for joining us at this late hour in England. We appreciate your time and information expertise. Thank you for your heartfelt concerns and your genuinity, and we look forward to touching base with you in the near future.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Jon. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. Take care.